you're saying that this strike season has policy and political implications. What does this mean for the ANC? And on top of that, what is the likelihood that opposition parties could perform better at local government level, as was suggested over the weekend with talk of an opposition realignment?
Well, the opposition realignment question has been on the agenda for quite some time. There was preliminary discussions, as far as I'm aware, amongst some of the opposition parties, mooted publicly by Helen Zille, about the fact that there ought to be some opposition realignment. But really this is working towards what I think over the long term is to define a political system around the fulcrum of 2 or 3 large major political interests. Whether that will happen in the short term, I'm not quite sure, because I think there are certain preconditions which are required for this kind of political realignment, many of which indeed I think are absent. Those are, firstly, that you would need some kind of broad ideological realignment amongst the different opposition parties. And if we look at the 2 extremes, perhaps, even though some of them are very small, for instance, a party like ZAPU would share very little in common with, for instance, a party like the Democratic Alliance. If, of course, their short-term interests suggest that all they want to be is anti-ANC or anti-ANC alliance, then they seem to have some kind of platform to come together on. But to come together simply on that platform means that their ability to cohere, to develop some cohesiveness, some gelling amongst themselves is going to be incredibly weak, because they don't share a broad ideological vision, firstly. Secondly, they don't share much by way of a common policy platform. Thirdly, there is very little political compatibility between them. And fourthly, of course, they will have to realign some of their organizational complements. For instance, the Democratic Alliance works on a federalist system. Other parties work on a more national system. Some of them have different branch structures. Some of them indeed don't have too many members, for that matter. So the relative strength within the broad opposition front will be determined, and determining who would take the lead would obviously have to be negotiated, but determined on the basis of who brings the largest numbers of membership, who has the most sound policy ideas, who's going to do the hardest work. So those kind of preconditions are necessary for some kind of political realignment. They're probably discussing it, but whether they find agreement on who's going to be the leader, who's going to hold which positions, is another matter entirely. They could obviously opt to go for a different kind of arrangement, and that arrangement would be simply an arrangement in which they work together, not structurally or not organizationally as one organizational complement, but simply to develop common policy positions on certain issues and then define how they would work at Parliament. But that would be efficient and possibly effective at the national level, but there too the seat distribution, particularly at National Parliament, is so skewed that the ANC's majority would still trump all of the opposition parties, even if they came together in one bloc. At the local government level, however, there is some experience of coalition making which has happened since the last local government elections. And there was even an instance in which the Democratic Alliance had to come together with the African National Congress. Of course, very surprising to many. But at that municipality, had they not come together, you literally would not have been able to form a government. But our experience of coalitions, particularly at the local government level, so far have been of 2 different types. The one is coalitions of what I would call contingency, that is where parties had to come together for the good of a particular municipality or a locality, otherwise they wouldn't have been able to form a government, for instance. And there, the example of Cape Town, the Cape Town Unicity government under Helen Zille was in fact a good example. The second type is the coalitions of expediency. And the coalitions of expediency are merely parties which come together so that they can keep another party out. They didn't share anything really in common. They didn't, it wasn't necessary for them to come together literally to actually have to form a government, but they came together because they simply wanted to thwart the ability of another party to rule. So these two types of coalitions, the coalitions of expediency and the coalitions of contingency, they can possibly work, but they do need certain structural commonalities in place. They need to share some kind of broad political vision. They would need to define the kind of policy approach that they want to take. And this often is easier to do once you are already and you have already tested your power through an election. It's much more difficult to do this kind of coalition building before contesting an election, because that's the point at which power and interest begin to matter for individual parties, and how they can negotiate the differentials of power between them when they come together, the kind of policy positions they take, the political platform that they will define for themselves, other than simply opposing something else, of course, is the real fulcrum at which they begin to either break down or they cohere. Now, whether they are going to come up with an alternative set of policy positions to what the ANC has mooted, but whether for local government or at the national level, remains to be seen. And I'm not sure that they would have many policy positions which can contest adequately with what the ANC has formulated, because clearly many people say that the ANC's policy trajectory is in fact very good. It's the instrumentation of that in terms of sound governance which is actually where it breaks down. So the political legitimacy for policy is enjoyed markedly by the ANC. It's the governance legitimacy and the governance credibility that is at question. And so if the opposition parties can show that they can govern better than the ANC, then of course they have some ability to garner a greater amount of support at the local level, particularly for the 2011 local government elections. But that of course depends on whether they can actually, before going into an election to contest both for power and interest, cohere around a common political platform and policy platform to define how they will work together. If they're not able to do that, because beyond doing that, you cannot get into power and then show how you can govern. Because the real test for them is the real way in which they can show up the ANC is to show that they can govern better than the ANC, not that they can enjoy broader and better political legitimacy than the ANC.
Thank you, Ebrahim.
Thank you very much.
That was Ebrahim Fakir of the Electoral Institute of Southern Africa speaking on the politics of South Africa's recent spate of protest action.